So welcome everyone to session 3, Cultural Context and Affirmative Pedagogies. And our facilitators will include myself and Mara Welsh Mahmood. And I'm going to be introducing the session in terms of some of the issues that connect very deeply with Professor Gord's notions of affirmative development as an extended way of thinking about what human development means in terms of the unfolding of life trajectories and extended forms of orientations to the realities of everyday life that underlie acquisition of traditional perspectives on academic skills that kind of take into account more richly the potential of understanding the embodied worlds in which culture and life happens that are part of the domains of development that lead to self-actualization in society and culture, including and taking up the positionality of young people in communities and around institutions that create the expectations that they have, and the notions of the professor they come up with understanding affirmative development, the development of persons is now beginning to pay more attention to the issues of how cultural settings themselves, embodied cultural settings, are provide the situations in which the interrelationships and sharing of consciousness and direction for consciousness among young people are creating incentives for our education systems and out-of-school systems to be able to take up the voices and stances of young people who have inherited the world that we're in. And so the issues of civic engagement and ability to be able to develop agency and collaboration with others, but centered on community and social values and humanistic orientations towards being productive and in thriving contexts are central to the context we're going to be discussing, and the perspectives of our presenters and discussants will center these issues before us in the context of thinking more richly about what pedagogies are at issue in terms of who controls the pedagogies and how they reflect the value systems of underserved community members. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mara, who will then give us an overview of our session presenters and proceedings. Mara?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much to the amazing conference organizers who are putting this all together with grace and able to facilitate and herd all of us cats. Mostly, thank you so much for the opportunity to get to engage more deeply with the work of Professor Gordon, and it's an honor to have you here with us this morning. As Richard said, my name is Mara Welsh Mahmood. I'm the executive director of a program called University Community Links. And I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to help bring together this just wonderful group of panelists today and presenters to explore cultural contexts and affirmative pedagogies together. The context broadly that we'll be exploring involve universities and communities working together to co-construct innovative and equitable learning environments. The panelists here with us today are all connected in some way to the University Community Links, or UC Links network. And UC Links was developed in response to the elimination of affirmative action at the University of California in 1995. It's a statewide strategy to help address the educational inequity and has grown beyond California to also encompass programs around the US and around the world. And UC Links builds on the work of Mike Cole's Fifth Dimension and Olga Vasquez's La Clase Mágica models of university community engagement that began in collaboration between the University of California, San Diego and nearby surrounding communities of Solana Beach. And also that work of the Distributed Literacy Consortium, of which Richard Durán was a part. And so many presenters here have rich, deep histories, and others come to this network more recently. The model typically includes university coursework that engages university undergraduates and graduate students with K-12 young people in a range of informal, often literacy-based activities. Oftentimes, these activities are set within a school or potentially out of school setting, and have been co-developed by university and community partners. And so today, you'll hear about a range of contexts in which this work is set. And you'll hear about communities that are impacted by displacement, by gentrification, by white supremacy and language injustices, structural and systemic racism. You'll also hear about a range of affirmative pedagogies that university and community partners are developing and putting into practice together. You'll hear about placemaking. You'll hear about resistance. You'll hear about the creation of third spaces. And you'll hear about designing for and cultivating care and belonging and wellness, these islands of humanity that Mike talked about in his comments. Together, we're going to tell a story. We're telling a story of resistance and sustainability and growth and hope. And I'm sorry, but I get kind of emotional about this because what I heard Professor Gordon saying before we came into this is that these times, and this is saying a lot, right? For somebody who was writing in the 50s and the 60s, but to have these times, these days, this day, following yesterday with oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court to eliminate affirmative action, the racism, the structural inequities that we're faced today are horrifying. And we're telling a story of resistance in the face of absolute and ongoing brutality, political, institutional, societal, interpersonal brutality. That's the context in which this work is set, and that is the context that this work is sustained in. Many of us have been engaged in this work for many decades. Professor Gordon has been engaged in this work for all of my life and beyond. And I just want to thank first all of the panelists and all of the people in this session who have been doing this work and committing themselves and their life's work to continue this. And this is the context that we're all here in today. And to speak a little bit about how this group has been continuing to do this work. So today I want to give you a brief overview just to tell you about how we're going to be running our session and also how we'd love for you to be able to engage with us. So Joanne, would you be so kind to put up the slide? Thank you. So our panel is going to start with 4 individual presenters. We have Kalonji Nzinga with us, who partners with the university, partners with Denver schools, public schools, and it's with the University of Colorado Boulder. We have Leslie López with us from UC Santa Cruz, Diana Arya from UC Santa Barbara, and Angela Booker from UC San Diego. And then next slide, we will hear from commentary and reactions from Micheal Cole, Professor Emeritus from UC San Diego, and Kris Gutiérrez, Associate Dean at the Berkeley School of Education. And then we're going to engage in some discussion. We'll have some back and forth among the panelists. And then we really want to open up the discussion and include people in the audience as well. And so given that there are some capacity constraints, we wanted to, and there isn't a chat or a Q&A, we were hoping that people would please type in. I tried to make this URL as easy as possible, but if you type in this URL, it's http://tinyurl.com/EG discussion, as in Edmund Gordon discussion. And so if you could be so kind to type that in, then you could engage with us in this Google Doc, and hopefully you will be able to add your comments and questions, and we will be able to take this up during our discussion. So I'm hearing that maybe the chat might go out to everybody. I'll try to put this link in the chat and see if maybe people could actually access it that way, which would be easiest. And so if you can get onto the Google Doc, you could add, oh, it looks like maybe people can see it. You could hop in and treat it just like the chat, or if the chat is working, maybe we can just use that. If people have access to the chat, can you type something in to say hi so we can know how we can engage with everybody? Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, I see. You can just read it. Okay. Oh, but look, there's people putting things in the document. I'm so excited. Okay, great. So I see you out there. Now we hope that we can use this as a way for you to interact and for you to add your comments. And we will be using this later on in our session to help direct the discussion. Thank you for joining with us in this experiment. And I'm going to hand things off to Kalonji Nzinga to start us off.
Thank you so much, Mara. As you know, you're a prized colleague of mine, and it's really amazing to be a part of the UC Links extended family. I'm really happy to be here to honor the work of Dr. Gordon and to really try to connect some of the work that I'm doing to some persistent themes that he has been thinking about for several decades. My name is Kalonji Nzinga. I'm an assistant professor of learning sciences and human development at the University of Colorado Boulder, where I direct the Laboratory of Ritual Arts and Pedagogy, which is also known as the RAP Lab. And I'm going to talk a little bit about an educational partnership that we have with two Denver public schools. But I want to, ground the conversation again in thinking about the troubling news from the Supreme Court and what it may mean for the future of affirmative action, and how really that means that now is a really important and pivotal time to revisit the work of Dr. Gordon with regard to affirmative development and also the idea of intellective competence. And so in his work, he describes intellective competence and character as the capacity to appreciate, know, and understand human experience in order to make sense of the world and address novel and specialized problems, right? And so this project with the RAP Lab that I'm going to talk about today identifies one of the specialized problems that we are trying to address. And that problem is displacement, right? And so could we cue that first slide or next slide? Thank you so much. So many of the students that we had the pleasure to work with have been displaced from their homes, sometimes both physically and psychologically. And so we look at displacement as operating on these two main levels, spatial displacement and cultural displacement. So on one level, students feel displaced from their neighborhood. So according to a study by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Denver has the second highest rate of gentrification in the nation, only preceded by the San Francisco Bay Area. I know we have a lot of California folks in the house today. They calculated that 27.5% of the neighborhoods that were traditionally working class, Latino, and Black residents were gentrified by upper middle class, mostly white residents between the years of 2013 and 2017, right? And so many families are being displaced, and the students that are left are noticing their communities changing. Students are also feeling displaced from their culture. In particular, they do not necessarily see their culture represented in the institutions in the neighborhood and specifically their curriculum in school, right? And so in Colorado, 34.5% of students are Latinx, while only 9.5% of their teachers are Latinx, right? And so I wanted to speak directly to this idea of displacement by highlighting one of the students whose artwork was produced during the program. And this is actually a painting produced by one of our learners. And I'm gonna read directly from an artist statement that he wrote. He said, "This piece represents my home where the anchor and red dot is, and the X where I am from, and all my family in Mexico is, along with my culture. The anchor on my home in Colorado represents how I'm not able to leave to go visit my family in Mexico because of the current state of where I'm from. This represents how wellness in my life is my family and culture. And I, as someone from Zacatecas, feel the need to try and reconnect with my roots and hold on to my culture for future generations. Because of that, I feel it is showing regeneration because I'm trying to keep my culture alive as many other people are." Right, and so you can see the themes of spatial and cultural displacement within this artwork, right? And you could see how the issues that are directly related to the neighborhood in terms of gentrification are echoed in many other forms of displacement, migration, immigration, colonization. And so we wanted to create an intervention that highlighted and created space to have conversation around this idea of displacement. And so the RAP Lab, again, the Laboratory of Ritual Arts and Pedagogy, created what we felt like was a project based on culturally relevant issues, right? And so we wanted to look at hip hop as a resource for reclaiming a sense of home in learning, right? And so it was based on a deep literature that includes folks in this room that said that students cannot learn when they feel displaced, that a sense of place, of home, of safety is necessary for learning. And so we rooted the curriculum in hip hop culture, a cultural art form that was born in Black and Brown communities and has traditionally created a sense of home within these communities, right? And so a group of community local artists, poets, and university students created a curriculum that encouraged young people to reimagine wellness and community transformation. And so could we move to the next slide? So students were exposed to the history of hip hop as a genre of storytelling and resistance. So they learned about how hip hop was a form of art that was about reclaiming space, from b-boys that claimed public space with their dance moves in parks, and to graffiti art that turned dilapidated buildings into canvases for street art, right? And so students used visual art, songwriting, audio production, and other art forms to express what they felt transformation looks like. And so their artwork often included themes of place, of local landmarks, et cetera. And so within the genre of hip hop, we call that repping your hood, right? And so it's a form of geographic pride. An American rapper by the name of Nas talks about the joy and pride that he felt as a 14-year-old in 1987 when he heard the name of his Queensbridge, New York, low-income housing project in a song on the radio. So hip hop and rap music being birthed within a network of American inner city neighborhoods or hoods has a history of rappers or MCs shouting out their local environments. As marginalized peoples across the global South, are cordoned off into slums, ghettos, shanty towns, and refugee camps, communities that are run down, underserved, dilapidated. It is often a struggle for youth not to take on a self-image in which they look at themselves as also dilapidated. And so this sense of community and cultural pride emanated throughout the artistic work that the students did, right? And so during our work, these students were creating this art serendipitously. As we were engaging in this work, students were also engaged in activism. During the time we were there, North High School students actually organized a protest and walkout in which they were advocating against some of the cultural displacement that was happening in their neighborhood and in their schools. And there were students in our class that happened to be leaders in this protest. And so for real, I want to be very careful. Please do not get the impression that the curriculum incited these protests. I promise you that we would take credit for it if we did that. We just so happened to be teaching this material that was directly relevant to the socio-political reality that students were engaged in, right? And so we found interesting ways in which what students were engaged in these protests was actually showing up in their art and vice versa. And so the research that we are currently engaged in now is really trying to make sense of the learning outcomes that came out of this process. And so our data set is basically including the art projects that youth created, the in-depth interviews with students that we did, as well as ethnographic data of our interactions and observations of the learning environment. And hopefully what we want to try to come to know is how can learning environments based around affirmative pedagogy, affirmative development, around culturally relevant pedagogy, how can those types of environments create a sense of place, resist actively against forms of displacement, and how can young people's voices be nurtured in these different storytelling genres, including hip hop. And so I will end there. I want to thank you so much for having me here. It's been an honor to show this work. It's been an honor to engage with these students here in Denver and to really share the art and the activism that they are engaged with in their community.
Thank you, Kalonji. Thank you so much. It's always so powerful to hear from you and hear about this, especially this new work that I haven't heard so much about. So this is very exciting. I'm going to hand things over now to Dr. Leslie López, who has been directing the Cora La Voz program at UC Santa Cruz and teaching the Associated Community Literacies course there for over 15 years, among other amazing things that Leslie has done here and abroad. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, and I'm so nervous, I have to say. I'm really looking forward to hearing what your comments are. And I have to say, I had to script myself. And so I'm going to be looking off screen a little bit as I try to work through my comments. I've got a lot of things to say about the first slide, not this one, but the next one. And I'm sorry that I don't have a lot of images. The presentation was beautiful, Kalonji. I'm really inspired, and I hope to sort of connect with a lot of the themes that you brought up. So first of all, what I want to say is that I'm hoping to talk about work that we are all doing on some level, which I call community-based critical literacies. I feel like that's common to a lot of our work. And I'd like to remind us of what we already know about how these modes work, about how it's transformative and decolonizing on cognitive, institutional, spatial, and local political levels, really how broad and deep these traditions are. And also to talk about how dominant power formations, including the pressure to present ourselves as unique and innovative, can operate to isolate, contain, and displace the work itself. Sometimes they drain our resources, misrepresent our work, purposes, and the people themselves. It's a replication of the forces that we are working against. My proposal is that we draw on the common strengths of our work, which articulate a coherent and successful strategy for justice across time and space. We've been working in Santa Cruz with first-generation Latina immigrant students since 2009. We use multimodal critical literacy techniques that are embodied and oral, like drama and interview. These are connected with text and scaffolds like graphic organizers, scripts, and poetry, drawing on Kris Gutiérrez's work. And we create digital storytelling and research projects. We make movies and we do photo voice, for instance. Some of the things we already know, which are that intentional activity design that supports collaboration and resocializes learning by shifting the cultural power that is always inscribed in communicative action, is so powerful in so many levels. For example, when we use language as a valuable bilingual tool instead of seeing it as a barrier, and we lift up Spanish as the medium to strengthen community and produce excellent work, it sets off a chain reaction of power shifts for participants, like the ones that Kalonji mentioned. This cannot be overstated in how it works like a detonator. We also know that community-based critical literacy education leverages the cultural strength and community values of the people in the space. It builds confidence and coherence among the people who are often misplaced, misunderstood, and muted and displaced. They're pushed out of school as well as society and even out of themselves. It draws out and articulates the imagination, the hope, the interest and voice of each person, and engages all of our human capacities for meaning making together. We know that these modes of work are the essence of popular education throughout the world. They've driven grassroots decolonization movements in many places. They also, at least at one point, informed writing and ethnic studies courses at the college level, to restore within and among people what gets stripped away or subtracted by an atomizing, standardizing schooling process and economy. But this is only available to those who survive this process. More profoundly, we know that these modes work to replace people who are fighting displacement within themselves and institutions on cultural and geospatial levels. People are replaced and even able to form an agenda for change when they have an environment or a space where their memories and dreams are heard and understood. And this is what we can create in a loving and a lovingly constructed third space. And this is what we do in our location that people don't have elsewhere. It generates power and coherence among people whose civilizations, languages, values, and bodies have low status in the dominant cultural systems around us. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we've found that the work that we do in these spaces is not just low status on our campus and in our community, but is so unfamiliar and in fact so counter-hegemonic to these forms of culture and schooling around us that it becomes unintelligible and unheard. In a hyper-capitalist environment of perpetual crisis, we are always at risk, and I use the term intentionally, of being deemed not worth the cost of the space and the time that we occupy. What we need is a way to articulate across time and space and institutional boundaries the value of this work in order to overcome or speak with the local configurations of dominant culture. I wanted to talk more about restorative pedagogies as a proposal to articulate the relational values and relational epistemologies that this work does and how it articulates global South traditions as well as the activity theory of the global North. But let's go to the next slide. So this depicts some of the breakthrough work that we did last year. It wasn't actually an intentional design. It came out of exigent circumstances, as they say. We worked with online photo voice in multiple sites across generations. I was teaching CLV at the same time that I was teaching a community mapping class, a PAR class, with Plaza Comunitaria, which was the parents in the community, and Jóvenes Sanos, young adults in an adjacent community, Watsonville. We were all working on the same theme, how people experience belonging and not belonging through photo voice, and this was in an online circumstance. One thing that I can say is that the explosion of expressions throughout on an intergenerational level made apparent the connectivity of the whole community. It also made apparent that after all of these years of working in the community, there was this relational strength, that we had a place, that the program had a place, that we had made a difference, because people were able to, and in fact needed to, come to their screens and be heard. And they were willing to overcome incredible barriers in order to do so. It resulted in this mosaic of really evocative depictions of how people felt they were a lot of times not belonging in their schools and in the community. And then one last thing I guess I wanted to say was, one thing it made apparent to me as someone who teaches teaching and also teaches research, and in my own location, I am devalued as a lecturer. I don't have the right to research in my job, although I have a PhD. It also made clear the ways in which this work disrupts the hierarchy of value between teaching and research, because the facilitation skills and processes that I was teaching in both spaces was almost identical. I was teaching focus group work with PAR, and I was teaching activity facilitation as teaching in CLV. They were both working to develop asset-based thinking and understanding in these communities. And in fact, they were all the same community. Okay, so that is it. That's all I have time for. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Thank you so much. I love all of the themes that you're bringing out. And just as a reminder, we welcome you to add your thoughts and questions and input in the Google Doc that I just put in the chat there. We'll hand it off next to Diana Arya at the UC Santa Barbara Gevirtz Graduate School of Education. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you. And what acts to follow? Oh, it's amazing scholars. I am honored to be a member of this amazing panel and to be given the opportunity to share how indebted my own work and thinking is to Dr. Gordon's. I am an associate professor in the Department of Education at UC Santa Barbara, and I'm also a faculty director of a university-housed literacy center that stretches across community contexts. And it's through this expanded effort that my colleagues and I strive to cultivate what Dr. Kalonji Nzinga, in his words, a sense of home. And so if you could do next slide. Wonderful. I lead a multi-program initiative called Community-Based Literacies, or what we call CBL. CBL is best characterized as a cooperative in which each invested person has co-ownership and has a say in what transpires across our programmatic spaces, which are located on our campus, at our partnering after school sites, and our partnering elementary school. The focal voice in every CBL program comes from our local youth, who are rooted in Chicanx traditions and bring a wealth of cultural, linguistic, and experiential knowledge, disciplinary knowledge that remains largely untapped in traditional school contexts. Our CBL cooperative also includes undergraduate and graduate students, faculty, and partnering leaders, parents, and teachers, and it's just a proud member of the UC Links network. All decisions we make when deciding our program goals, our projects, and our activities are guided by the sets of questions featured on this slide. Our questions are organized by 3 design principles: agency, co-learning, and belonging. There's no set curriculum. And through ice-breaking activities and open discussion prompts and translanguaging discussions, all of those, and the music that folks bring into this space, we elicit proclivities and perspectives from our young colleagues who collaboratively steer our ship to real and fantastical destinations. Every member is a co-learner. I am a co-learner. And as such, I get to learn what others know, what expertise is represented by our members. The CBL vibe, if you will, is one of curiosity and care. We are open to new ideas, new suggestions, and when someone is absent, we miss them. We miss them because they belong in our community. This negotiated curriculum of knowledge building and creativity takes on a new shape each year, and as such, we are better able to keep apace the moving targets of sociocultural, sociopolitical, environmental, economic, and technological movements that increasingly outpace the glacial progress of school-based educational policies and practices. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. As members of CBL, we encourage all forms of contribution. All are important. The stories people have and bring with them, their songs, poetry, and artifacts containing knowledge and expertise that have been handed down through generations, as well as creations in real time in our shared space, which in all such moments becomes a sacred place, one strengthened by translanguaging practices through which songs of environmental wisdom and healing, secret healing recipes are carried and stamped into our collective archive of agency, co-learning, and belonging. Such collective knowledge building is like a journey into uncharted waters. We're a maritime community, uncharted waters. But we're on a boat filled with knowledgeable guides. Each story, each song, each work of art is a spotlight into the void of silent, or rather silenced, knowledge and experience. I've become passionately curious about this void, one that James Baldwin wrote about many years ago, about a musician whose instrument channels, in Baldwin's words, the roar rising from the void and imposing order on it as it hits the air. And the world needs to hear their roar, our roar, and we are the musicians that bring a different order on it. Transformational work can be hard and even painful at times, but the beautiful truth is that our young co-learners are far more immune to tried and trues than used to be's. The nimble neuroplasticity of youth can show us how easy it can be to start anew into the known unknown. And given Dr. Gordon's work on educational assessments, I would be remiss not to mention our CBL literacy assessments. I developed the strategy use measure and the critical reading assessment, both of which are grounded on the same design principles I described earlier. Sidestepping the bell curve, these assessments I've developed with a team of graduate and undergraduate students at UC Santa Barbara are designed to support the transformations needed in our schools in the imperative to raise critical thinkers that are needed now more than ever in our increasingly digitized, socio-politically tumultuous society. I'm happy to share that I see both enthusiasm and relief in the uses of these assessments and instructional planning in the local space. However, it's also important to acknowledge, and I would say echo Dr. López, Leslie López, as she clarified, much of the work that I do in the service of learning, which was echoed a lot yesterday, isn't fully recognized or valued in higher education. And given the realities that Dr. Mahmoud outlined earlier, we need our higher institutions to be bold in valuing what matters most. I have chosen a career path that has proven more challenging, but also more rewarding. In following Dr. Gordon's example, I will keep pushing for the changes needed across the educational spectrum in order to transform our academic spaces into equitable places for learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you for setting that example of what it looks like to be bold. I could say that about everybody here. I love this. Definitely. And now I have the pleasure to hand things over to Angela Booker, Professor of Communications at the Department of Communications at UC San Diego. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's really been a pleasure to be a part of this today and in preparation. And I'm excited for the opportunity to contribute here. I wanted to say, as I mentioned to Dr. Gordon earlier today, that you know, early in my career, one of the first publications I had was in a volume called Educating Comprehensively: Varieties of Educational Experience, which was co-edited by Linda Lynn, Hervé Varenne, and Dr. Gordon. And it was one of my first scholarly experiences really outside of my graduate training. And it was an amazing set of chapters and authors. And it really affirmed for me the possibility of thinking about learning across wide scales in institutional spaces. Today's a really emotional day for me. I feel like I don't usually sit in talks and listen and feel so moved by the work that everyone does together. Sorry. It is an intense time in the world, and the last few years I've spent a lot of time questioning the effectiveness of my own effort in community work. Not the value of it ever, but watching intractable problems and the repetition of certain kinds of patterns has really, it's been such a challenge. And as a parent, especially, it's been a challenge to look into a really potentially very different future than I had been imagining, you know, in my 20s. So with that, I'm going to try to pull myself together and talk a little bit about what I'm up to and how it's been informed and encouraged and hopefully can continue to plant the seeds of Dr. Gordon's work. So I'm thinking quite a bit about how young people and multi-generational communities come to recognize the character of participation in our communities. And so if we could go to the next slide. Thanks so much. I have a paper coming out in a special issue of Educational Policy called Designing for a Productive Politics of Participation in Research Practice Partnerships. That's a mouthful, RPPs. I like Leslie's terms, community-based critical literacies. I'm going to borrow that here. I think one of the things that my work over years has shown me relentlessly is that as much as I love to think with a frame of learning as participation, it's very important to recognize that there is this threat of fixed marginal positions. And in this piece, I started with the notion of legitimate peripheral participation, which I encountered through Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger's work on situated learning. And one of the things that they say that I found a lot of people don't discuss actively is that there is the potential to be made legitimately peripheral in a fixed way. They don't use those terms, but they describe it as the potential for being held in a marginal position in a legitimate way. And I think what we're seeing at the Supreme Court, for instance, is an example of that. So in this paper, I was talking about trying to discern for young people that a productive politics of participation in a community is this process of analytically trying to discern what kind of movement is possible in a community of practice and where is it limited. So they asked me if I would make some images, and so I'm sharing them with you here as a way to try to visualize what it might look like. And so for the kinds of work that I've done, many young people, for various reasons, end up in these communities that speak a language of the image of the possibility of full participation, but actually operate in the space of the fixed positionality. And so trying to leap into these fuller spaces of participation actually concentrates power in an imagined center. And Lave and Wenger were really careful to say that they were not working toward participation at the center. They were talking about full participation, and that's the sort of distinct orientation here. If there is a concentrated center, getting from the outer edges of it to the center is quite a difficult task, and I think we see that, and we can feel that when we look, for instance, at what's going on with our own leadership in this country. Full participation, on the other hand, can move in a lot of directions, and I think offers a lot of sort of permeable spaces. And so as I started to try to think about this, if I could go to the next slide, please. I was trying to understand how these movements happen in relation to a notion of scale, because the stakes are so high. And I realized that so much of the way I hear scale and scaling up discussed has to do with starting with something small and then disseminating it to larger and larger groups. And I wanted to think about what it means to scale at a relational level, because I don't think that it's easy or non-trivial to try to scale something that looks like it works between two people, child, parent, student, teacher, peer-to-peer, versus, say, within a local community of practice where, for instance, we do our work in a learning center in an apartment complex with all ages and undergraduates visiting from our university, right? That's a different kind of scaling. How do we think about the relationships across organizational roles and positions when we work in communities that are varied? You know, the case manager and the community director, the property manager at the workplace, myself as a researcher and faculty member at the university, the kids who are students in their schools, and the undergraduates who are students at the university. And how do we think about scaling relationships through institutional tensions, whether it's dealing with opportunities with housing and urban development and developers and owners of homes in places where people make their lives, who are also trying to make their profits, and university narratives and relationships, and how our resources can move toward the university and away from the community. So these areas, these sort of senses of relational work have been a deep concern of mine. And so I've been trying to think about this from the approach of design. How do you design for the relational work to begin to reach across these scales of relationship? And so I have this metaphor, this book that I'm working on using a metaphor of nodal design, where I'm referring to this notion of a node and an anti-node. I work with a colleague, Victor Minces, on a project where we work with sound. And if you think about a xylophone, for instance, and you think about how it's held at two specific points, those are the nodes. And if you don't hold the little key at the right place, you get a thunk when you hit it. But if you hold it at the right place, you can get this very resonant sound. And so what strikes me about this node as a way of thinking for justice in the future, I can't believe it's already been 8 minutes, is that I'm referring to this idea that design can offer form. It creates space for a particular kind of practice. And that practice strives for, in nodal design, the lightest possible touch, the least limit on the possible flow of our lives, our hearts, our minds, while reckoning with historic power relations and hegemonic habits. And finally, that sustains and adapts relational work as ethical work. And so if we think of music, if we think of a guitar, a million, a billion, a trillion, an unnamed number of possibilities can come out of a guitar, depending on the player. But it still provides form. You have to deal with its actual structure, right? You have to learn to manage the strings and the body and the resonance of the tool. And so I think that what I'm driving toward is that practice requires a kind of care and a kind of engagement that can be sustained in a specific way. So that we can have relationships with one another, with land and with water in the living world, with our systems for living, with our facility for repair, and with our possible futures that are equitable, because they allow us to think and design flexibly across these relational scales. I want us to be able to anticipate and take responsibility for the likelihood that we will reproduce these systems and patterns of oppression that we keep seeing, and have a clear-eyed and sustained attention to power relations across these scales, so that we can courageously stand for the right to be different and yet also to belong. I intended, when I started, to talk more specifically about particular projects, Black Surf Week, Summer in Social Justice, work at the Learning Center, partnerships with the Maritime Museum here and the Black Mariners and Black Politics, Black Mariners and Black Pacific project that we're doing. And I'm happy to answer questions about the specific nature of these ideas. But I really wanted to, I think as I spoke, try to think openly together with you about really about how we can look at the close relational work that we all do in our community practice and how we might design toward these real shifts in our relations of care, because the relations of violence are so strong and overtaking us in such a deep way. And I think we really, really need the ability to now design out more fully beyond these the small local spaces that we are often in. Thanks so much for the opportunity and the time.
Wow, thank you, Angela. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of the presenters so far. I know that you had such a brief amount of time, and I hope that, like you said, Angela, you'll be able to expand more in the first part of our discussion. And first, though, we want to hand things over to our amazing discussants to offer some reactions and commentary and thoughts. And first, we'd love to hear from Professor Emeritus Micheal Cole from the UC San Diego Department of Communications.
Good morning, everybody. Like all the other participants here, I really feel incredibly lucky to be present here. Just before we started, I had a chance just to remember with Ed Gordon when we first met, when I was an assistant professor at Yale University and had begun to do cross-cultural work and was beginning to work with various communities associated with Head Start. And there was Ed, who was tasked with a small job of evaluating the massive Head Start program. And who has, we spoke, I said, I thought what we're really talking about here is like the 60s and 60 years of research, and they happen to coincide. So as an old person here, I thought one of my tasks was to remember what was going on back in the day and to consider our current circumstances in that light. So I have, if you just start to think about what was going on, 1964, 1963, we have the killing of Kennedy. 1964, the beginning of the war on poverty, 1 decade after Brown and the Board of Education, which is apparently going to be re-examined by a variety of powerful people in this country. And the Moynihan report, which some of you may remember, which identified problems, sort of pathology of the Black family associated with the gender roles that was inimical to the values of schooling. And so these various ways to try to influence, support, presumably, the Black family were instituted or were talked about. And in 1965, Ed Gordon wrote an article for the Review of Research and Education on what he referred to as the socially disadvantaged child. 1969, Arthur Jensen published a paper in the Harvard Educational Review, the hypothesis of which was that people of African descent were genetically predisposed to sort of concrete thinking and relatively incompetent at thinking in terms of higher order concepts. That was the professional world into which I was initiated. And it was one where Ed Gordon was absolutely a key player. And in the succeeding years, all the topics that we heard about today were articulated in a way that invited critical and engaged attention. Just to mention some of them, like books and major articles on equality of educational opportunity in 1974, on educational resilience in spite of the odds, 1994. Education and justice, a word which we didn't hear a lot about for almost more than a decade following that in 1999. Racism and mental health in 2000. Closing the achievement gap in 2004. 2006 is really important work on supplementary education. And you can think about almost all the work that we've heard about today as various forms of what Ed was imagining back then in terms of the opportunities that you could infuse into neighborhoods, opportunities for a way to transform your local experience and your neighborhoods, followed in 2017 by neighborhoods of promise. And I can't even, I can't barely imagine what other stuff that I sort of pass by because time is short. So it's all been talked about again, all been talked about before. And I think what I'd just like to comment on a few of the things that I'm just writing down, not preparing ahead of time, but that I took from what people were talking about. One is that everything you're seeing here now has a name. There is a legitimate field of multiple legitimate fields of activity that didn't exist when Ed was starting out, right? So we have participant action research. We have a variety of kinds of design-based intervention research. We have, as we'll hear, we have Kris Gutiérrez here with social design experimentation. We have a variety of forms which embody alternatives of the sort that Ed was trying to get people to recognize these such possibilities and figuring out ways in which to increase their number, increase their variety, and increase their location in the neighborhoods of the people who really badly needed them. And I jotted down some other characteristics of what we've seen. They're intergenerational. And if there was ever a time when I thought intergenerational was needed, boy, this is it. Because it's certainly the case that the old people have no solution to things, but they know a lot of wrong answers that the young people might try to learn a little bit from. The collapsing of teaching and research. For me, even as a very senior professor, it was always an issue that classes that I taught were on the topic of my own research. On the other hand, they were also on the topic of how I could fuse some sort of practice and theory practice thinking into the lives of social science students who in their large numbers were treated to multiple choice tests and short answer questions as an absolute sort of bureaucratic necessity. We hear now, and it's good to hear the notion of the word power as we try to look at, and this is power as we think about it in a macro way, and power at every level of social interactions. And almost every time in each of the talks we've had, we have this very interesting way in which there's a leveling of power in the activity itself. By virtue of co-learning, by virtue of drawing upon everybody's expertise, you reduce the power relations and you open up the spaces for genuine co-development. Very important. Everybody recognizes, and it's like become a cliche, that we don't want STEM, we want STEAM. And they're really the notion, which is so important in work on resistance and on being deviant and finding spaces of humanity, that you find the arts as a common historical cultural thread that can bring people together and allow them to weave new forms of activity. And then, of course, as Angela mentioned very importantly, there's the issue of scale and what you mean by scale, because ordinary ways of trying to scale things are in fixed patterns that ignore local contingencies. And this is all about the local control and local agency in people's lives. So I think just we can, in discussion, I could certainly talk about some more of the challenges, but I just end with this, which is that a big challenge, one that was not there, we couldn't even imagine in 1963, 64, 65, was that as psychologists, we would be required to understand the local, cultural, historical, economic context of our own work, to the point where institutional analysis is every bit as important to what we're trying to do as analysis of whether or not a particular test is valid for the population that it was given on. This is a form of education which doesn't currently exist anywhere. It takes years to accumulate it if you're allowed to move around. And it requires us to think about the institutional barriers in our own institutions as we fight for the space in the university to be allowed to create this kind of collaborative education. So I wish everybody well for the future. And I turn this over to Kris, I think.
So Mara, should I continue?
Thank you, Mike. Yes, Kris, you are on. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope I have a coughing fit. I hope I can get through this. So it's so fitting and appropriate that I follow Mike, as this session and these projects that the panelists have presented in my own work flows from the legacies of Professor Ed Gordon and Micheal Cole. And I'll say a little bit more about these intertwining legacies in just a minute. A number of us participating in this tribute to Professor Gordon have been fortunate enough to been a beneficiary of his mentorship, his scholarship, his imagination, and his generosity. How fortunate that so many generations of scholars of color have had Professor Gordon as a role model, as there were so few like him, and even fewer, who brought a humanistic perspective, a moral imperative, a commitment to equity, and an activist sensibility to understandings of learning and development. Dr. Gordon's work at its core is known for its humanistic and multidisciplinarity and approach, and he brings this approach to social problems in which teaching and learning and assessment are always used in affirmative ways, always toward possible and more just futures. In my short time today, I'd like to note how the legacy of this renowned psychologist, who, by the way, if you read his writings, and I also learned from my friend Carol Lee, was also an ordained minister, which is, I think, really important here, because his work has always been fundamentally about building communities of empowerment for the next generation, in which the ethical and moral dimensions of human learning have always undergirded and guided what he did. As speakers have already mentioned, Professor Gordon's concept of affirmative development necessarily involves learning and thriving across time and space, across the lifespan in which the contextual and social cultural are continually implicated. As far back as the 60s, as Mike has just elaborated, Professor Gordon was designing what he calls supplementary education, in which robust learning occurred in and out of schools. But this should come as no surprise, because Dr. Gordon was in conversation with so many people, Du Bois and Paul Robeson, and so many others who were thinking together about, again, these imagined futures for people. Professor Gordon has always understood that children and youth learn through participation in everyday cultural practices across multiple settings, learning intergenerationally in families, peer social networks, and across particular institutions, from schools to churches to community settings. His work couldn't be more timely as we face dire social, educational, and moral challenges in which youth, and notably youth from non-dominant communities or minoritized youth, are placed even more at risk. I already knew this, as I have learned from him across my own academic life, but as you've learned from the panelists, Dr. Gordon's intellectual legacy parallels and intersects the legacy of Micheal Cole and cultural historical views of learning and development, from which concrete utopias known as fifth dimensions have emerged. The intellectual and social legacy of Dr. Gordon is also animated in the work of Micheal Cole and scholars and the panelists who have been part of these fifth dimensions, these imaginative spaces, which are hybrid spaces, third spaces, if you will, in which relational equity, translingual practices, the ethical resistance practices, and re-mediation, right, and consequential forms of learning were normative and yet iterative. I really want to mention very briefly several key principles that I believe illustrate the shared concepts of Professor Gordon and those of us employing a critical cultural historical approach to learning and development. Importantly, both these approaches focus on the not yet. As a Russian scholar once noted, I don't remember who, but Mike surely will, Americans are so preoccupied with who the child is instead of who the child can become. This focus on possible futures lifts up future-oriented approaches to learning exemplified across the work of the panelists and notably in Dr. Gordon's lifelong work. We see how attention to historicity, prolepsis, diversity, and culture are shared across our collective work. For the panelists, and here we all learn from Micheal Cole, developing an historicized view of the present, that is how the past is indexed in the present, helps us develop and engage a newly imagined projection, as well as designs of our futures as individuals in collectives. This attention to history helps us open up the process of prolepsis, what Micheal Cole defines as the cultural mechanism that brings the past into the present, making prolepsis an important design principle in the development of youth's future selves and a future-oriented agenda, something that we saw across all the talks today. There's also deep attention to understanding diversity as a resource. I use diversity here in the ecological sense, where diversity means greater variability and an essential resource for transformability and maintaining a resilient and sustainable ecology. I believe this is a useful and generative understanding of the role of diversity as being fundamental to the preservation of human and other forms of life, an understanding that should compel us to rethink the ways we conceive and employ the concept of diversity in our scholarship. Ideas that are fundamental to developing a new pedagogical imagination, as Dr. Gordon often implored us to do, in which affirming pedagogies are central. What my dear friend Mike Rose called respectful pedagogies, that is, pedagogies worthy of the students with whom we learned. And finally, I call attention to how Dr. Gordon and the panelists conceive of culture, a concept made central in our work. Here, culture is a verb, not a noun, and focuses on how people live culturally, where culture is not understood as uniformly shared in cultural communities, and thus motivates us to always attend to regularity and variance in communities. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, Professor Gordon, for illustrating how to take expansive understandings of learning and development to develop newly imagined social futures for all youth, while also troubling deficit assumptions of learning and development and youth. Thank you.
Thank you, Kris. As we see on the screen, please be aware of the Google Doc that you can access via the URL that is indicated to contribute to our discussion. We're now going to enter into a 30-minute period in which we'll devote the first half of it to panelist conversation with each other and with some reactions that I will introduce to cover certain topics. And then in the final portion of the session, we're going to, with Mara's monitoring of the Google Doc for comments, we'll be entertaining questions and comments from the participating audience. And of course, Professor, you are most welcome to participate in this rich conversation. And please be thinking of comments that you might wish to bring in at any point. And I think it would be really cool, Professor, if you wouldn't mind giving us some reactions to what you've heard to kick off our our discussions before we turn it over to the panelists to react to their comments. So you're welcome, Professor, to come and offer us some thoughts on your reactions to what you've heard.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm going to pass because, frankly, at the moment I'm too moved to say much. But thank you.
Okay. No issues. With the many of us meet weekly with the professor. We know he is not at a loss for words, and we know that cooking in there percolating are some interesting reactions to the topics we've covered. So let's turn it over to the panelists. Now we're in an open conversation mode, and I invite folks to comment. I can kick stuff off just to get us going, but I'd like to have you react to each other's presentations. I think one kind of comment that strikes me as challenging and worthy of some discussion somewhere along the line concerns the integration of visions of after-school programs that are built on community perspectives and on the life worlds of participants who are in our settings, like UC Link settings. And it goes without mention that there are many other around the world, there are many other movements like ours that are contributing now very actively in our global context to be able to share knowledge development in community settings that are being involved in these creative processes. But one kind of tension I wonder about is the relationship between the practices that are possible in out-of-school settings that are creative and innovative and constitutive the way we've discussed, and what is possible in classrooms. There is an interesting tension and set of issues here. And I'm wondering whether any of you have reflected on those possible relationships given the perspectives that have been offered in our presentations. Kalonji, I saw you shaking your head, so you live it, so I kick it off.
I'm happy to talk a little bit about that, and there are a number of tensions that exist in that space for sure. I certainly have done work in both spaces, in both after school and out of school, informal learning environments. And the project that I presented on today is, a collaboration with, public schools. And so there are differences for sure when it comes to constraints that teachers are engaged in, the process that we went through to actually make that happen. But it actually, to be honest, I'm feel informed a lot by Angela's comments, Dr. Booker's comments about scale. I think are kind of related to this, and the way that was framed was really different than I had thought about it, in thinking about like scaling even up from like a conversation or like the dynamics between individuals to like larger institutions and systems. And it's just reminding me of the process that we went through to design this project. Was first a collaboration between artists, community artists, the ethnic studies teacher in which the class took place, university students, myself. And I think one thing that we noticed as we were going through the design process was that there was some dynamics of our conversation, of sharing our own art together, of sort of sharing our own perspectives, that once we got into the classroom, I'm going to use this word now and cite you, Dr. Booker, but that was like a scaling up in a certain way. There was a scaling from like the type of discourse that we were having within these design meetings that was about sharing work, thinking about these issues of displacement in our own lives, and then how that kind of scaled up when we actually created the discursive space that was the classroom that included, of course, students as well. And so I don't know, making me think a little bit about, this idea of scale, but then also because of the fact that it was bridging these conversations amongst different factions of the community and teachers, both educators, university. It was this way of like almost bringing what was, beyond the capacity of what the teacher could do by herself, and it was sort of expanding sort of the community, like a community-led process. And so just some thoughts that I'm thinking about in terms of that idea.
Great comments. I think one thing that comes into play here, very interesting, is that in Angela's notion of scaling up, we have also present in the scaling up a kind of a network distributed implication analysis. When her analogy using the music metaphor, the harmonies that resonate with other nodes in a network that activate relationship and understandings and analysis in terms of the consequences of any one attention in any one node resonating with affordances in other parts of a network of deep relationships that constitute the implications for the realities that are occurring. Angela, you have any comments on how to help us think more clearly about what you mean by resonance and the implications of scaling up in your conception?
Thank you for that. Well, I mean, I have thoughts. I don't know how coherent they are. I'll give my best shot. I think Victor and I also recently did a paper at ICLS on a concept we're theorizing called harmonized mutual development. And one of the things I find as a teacher in classrooms is it's really hard to, for lack of a better word, sell students on the notion that their learning matters to each other. If my neighbor over here is getting an F and I'm getting an A, I'm good, right? And that shouldn't, I think, be the case. That our learning matters to each other. And I think in practice it does. We know that when we're in the room together or in the Zoom together learning, it matters that people have thought about and reflected on the ideas that were assigned. It matters that we engage each other honestly and openly and with interest. And so how do we think about that in a way that actually can become practically meaningful to students, that isn't just in say like a group project where you're a lot of people describe living and dying by the free rider or something like that, the person who's not doing the work, as opposed to having a productive affirmative relationship with our mutual harmonized learning. I think there's also the challenge of discordant moments, which is where we get into politics and power. What are the conditions under which we can express difficulty or conflict and still be cared for? I'm reminded of, I think it's an article by, I'm probably gonna get the authorship backwards, but Maxine McKinney de Royston, Per Vakil, Naila Nasir, and I think there's another author in that one about politicized caring. And I think it speaks to, that piece really speaks carefully to producing learning environments where we can be real and honest about the full expression of our lives, everything that's happening to us as people, and not just what's happening to us as a student or a math student or a student in a particular moment. And so those notions of a politics of difference and care existing together, I think, are part of these resonances. So with a notion of nodal design, what really struck me was Victor is a cognitive scientist, and he's really getting into describing these nodes and antinodes. And they're in all materials. I mean, you can pick up a broomstick and you can find the nodes, and you can get that ringing resonance. And I was listening to him and I'm going, this is such a beautiful sort of form of justice. To be held that way, to me, is a form of politicized caring. To be held in a way that honors who you are and your integrity and your freedom. That sees you and allows for your dignity and your presence, but still holds you, right? And makes a certain kind of practice possible, feels like to me what is missing in a lot of classrooms and learning environments, because in part it's hard to find our connection where and when do we matter to each other, when power kind of sits inside of grading and assessment. But I think formative assessment, Janet Coffey has beautiful work on formative assessment and the importance of that, the learning we give to each other as we go along, not just the summative one. I think those are moments when we could redesign the nature of those relations. I think Head Start is a beautiful example of that kind of caring. In preparing for this talk, I was mentioning to my wife, who Dr. Gordon is, and she went, "Oh my gosh, I went to Head Start." Recognizing how important those kinds of caring are. I don't know that people experience that in classrooms over the lifespan. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, Richard. But
You're creating harmonies with many different associations that are exploring what your understandings. Leslie, you had want to comment on your perspectives on articulation for scale that resonate with what we're conversing about. And then following your comment, we'll call on Kris to help us understand her perspectives on sister projects and how they connect with the idea of these resonances that are possible as a form of consciousness in developing our project orientation. So Leslie?
Yeah, thank you. So one thing, I really liked your model, Angela, about the different layers of these, these concentric circles and how we scale up. And I often think about our work as these, sort of not just concentric, but, multi-layered, intersecting activity practices, activity theory practices, and how we facilitate them and also connect them, even just within a project. And then and in order to bring all of these resources that Kalonji talked about and to even launch a project, it requires all of this coordination and articulation work to get it going and then to maintain it. And I wanted to because I used the word articulation in my presentation, and I just wanted to unpack that a little bit. And because I have studied Gramsci in my own work, and also Du Bois, who, they make really apparent how different sectors in their thinking could either work in alliance and coalition, or they could fall apart. And they talk about betrayal. This is political work, and so they reveal how the potential for shared political power falls apart when people are selfish or afraid or betray the potential for justice. And I'm sorry that that's a sad way to go, but that is what happened, and that results in what we know about. But the articulation theory that Castells, for instance, introduced in network theory is it's potentially different and related, because it in some ways can flatten our understanding of what is deeply more political and coordinated in groups or in communities or in nodes, a different meaning of node than what Angela is talking about. And I like to use the word articulation in my work because it also expresses how the work that we do to draw out voice and to help people articulate what they have inside and the potential that they have can grow often, from very small places that we bring resources into and develop out into hopefully larger and connected ways. So I just wanted to put that terminology out there and also help us think about the ways in which articulation does and does not happen. And often the personnel that does this kind of articulation work, and how when we strip out the time and the capacity to connect over time and space, when those tasks are written out of our brief, for instance, or when people become too fragmented and too stretched to connect, that is where it breaks down. People who want to connect, who know how to connect, who are the nodes in their community, when they are displaced, removed, or defunded, that's when communities are crumbled. That's when the potential for this can also, against, not for selfish reasons, become dismantled.
Thank you, Leslie. Well, Kris wanted to comment on sister projects, and I think an interesting issue that raises, Leslie, from your points was that when for these resonances to occur, there have to be forms of expression about whether the residents are being picked up or not, or being opposed, and there is an issue of how networking and sister projects might be a way of facilitating the expression of stance and consciousness about common issues. Kris?
Yes, and so the notion of sister projects came from Shireen Vasugi, with whom I've had the, excuse me, good fortune to work. So this came up kind of organically because a number of us, former students who are now professors in their own right, working in the context of Las Redes, our own fifth dimension. And we were troubling the notion, some conceptualizations of scale and implementations of those notions of scale, and what gets lost, what gets privileged, and how to preserve the attention to historicity and the specificity of the local that really have made our fifth dimensions sustainable, right? They've lasted for years and years and years, and I think that's related to that attention. And so what we found organically is that a number of us that had been working together went off and started developing their own versions. And that's where Shireen started talking about sister projects, because they were not replicas. It was not meant to be cookie cutter. It was meant to say, what did we learn, and what are the design principles that can be resituated, reconceived, reimagined in ways that are meaningful and beneficial to the communities, right? And so this became a very important part of social design-based experimentation, right? In which this attention to these elements was really important. And then Shireen, of course, conceptualizes the sister projects, because they were in the family, weren't they? Right? They were recognizable as being part of the family. There was a shared history, and Mike has written about this forever, so I hope you say something, Mike. You can see him echoing through what we're saying. And so because they were part of the family, we had to recognize that, but yet they were different. And so I love her notion of sister projects. Mike, why don't you say something about this? Because you've talked about sustainability in these ways that I think really resonate with the conversation.
Oh, other people have stuff to say, really. I noticed, and I'm just asking here, that in the Google Doc, there was a good deal of a number of questions about evaluation and about showing effects, and I think that's Richard, of course, is an expert on the topic of evaluation, and Ed is long-term has worried about that. One of the things that when you design this way, first of all, the idea is absolutely what you said, Kris. That is, you have a set of principles that you have to rise to the concrete, as they say, right? You have to take those principles and be able to embody them in particular locations in the town and country learning center. And then they have to grow they have to grow from both sides. They cannot be a one-sided thing and grow. But very important, from over 100 examples of people trying to start out these UC links, some version of an after-school an out-of-school activity that involves undergraduates, and something that's very interesting to the children, that's voluntary. The children can come there. They don't have to be, have to be somewhere else. In all of those, that we have never had a case where an activity was not continued because of a lack of evaluation. Even though the majority of the money we got for the research was devoted to issues of evaluation, and evaluations were done. For that, I'd suggest that people look at the book on the fifth. There's a book on the fifth dimension by the group which just lays out all of the multiplicities of ways to evaluate this, in which there are some real experiments, some quasi-experiments, some formative experiments, what have you, a variety of things. But the question is the activity of importance to the local community? If it's of importance to the local community, then that becomes a decisive factor in the long run as to whether or not you have a successful and sustainable program. I think that's a very important fact to take into account. So a lot of we have to go through what is referred to as evidence-based research. Very odd notion of evidence that is put into that. Thank you for putting that up. People can check it out. But the fact of the matter is that all the money that went into that, it never had a decisive influence on whether a program continued or not. That was a matter for the local participants and their institutions. So everybody's coming back to the level of institutions here, and all of these forms of research remediate institutional relationships. If you cannot stabilize those relationships, and by stabilize, I mean get in dynamic flow with the local institutions, you're going to disappear. So there's levels of interdisciplinary research where you have to keep track of things at more levels than one human can do possibly. So it requires teamwork.
And I think Mike, oh, sorry.
Yeah, never mind. That's, you know.
I was just thinking your comment leads right into, I think, one of the other questions that's in the Google Doc about can anybody provide a good example of lasting institutional change?
Yes. I mean, the answer, I mean, you know the data, you yourself know that that's the case.
Well, I think I would love to hear, I could definitely speak to this, but I think it's definitely more meaningful to hear from the local campuses and the local partners. What does lasting institutional change look like on your campus or for your work? I mean, I will say quickly, as somebody who helps to coordinate this larger network, the fact that we have been around since 1996 is lasting institutional change, that these programs have been supported by the University of California and the legislature of the state of California against all odds is amazing. And in order for that to happen, individual people, and like Mike was saying, that has to happen in individual local communities in order for that to happen. And so, and that does definitely mean that there has to be value placed on this work locally in terms of people's promotion and tenure. You know, and I know in the case of UC San Diego, the department actually pays for the course, the part of the instructor for this to happen, instead of faculty members constantly fighting to do a +1, you know, and have this course as something extra, or running this program as an independent study. So I think if other people can provide what the examples are of institutional change locally, I think that would be meaningful.
Let me give you two massive ones. If you think about the movement from enslavement to emancipation to participation in the society, as limited as it is for Black people now, it's so much different from what it was when I was born, and even more different from what it was at the time of the Reconstruction, and compare it to the period of enslavement, or in modern times, the difference between the role of women in our society in 1900, 1930, 2000. These are struggles that our predecessors engaged in and resulted in magnificent, lasting change in the society. Richard has invited me to speak earlier. I'll say one word about it. Both Micheal and Professor Gutiérrez mentioned my pedagogical imagination, and Kris introduced us to the term prolepsis, which one of my postdoctoral fellows likes to talk about. Prolepsis, I think, speaks to the future, projection onto the future. Pedagogical imagination speaks to the same thing, the capacity of the brain to think about things and to invest effort in making them happen. I think that the combination of those two words have to be a part of the dialogue for us educators. Most of what we're doing is proleptic for the future, developing stuff that may not exist right now, period.
Thank you, Professor. The issue of becoming is something that you have given us a lot of attention, and you have mentioned the work of thinkers like Kenneth Gergen, and thinking about relational identity, and we can say we'd add to that our attention to the added attention to the social political implications of prolepsis, which is realizing the kinds of issues that are being discussed here. Diana, you haven't had a chance to offer a comment, but knowing you as a dear colleague who always has something to add, and you help enlighten us so much on some of these concerns, do you care to add your own comment to follow up?
Well, I mean, I'm taking it in as a co-learner. When I think of lasting change, I'm going back to the idea of what does lasting institutional change mean? When I think of anything lasting, I think of sustainability, especially now. And a lot of us are operating on unsustainable energy, and in many ways. Think of all the pressures that we get institutionally. There's so much about higher education that is not sustainable. And so, and we are focusing on how do we foster a sustainable sense of home in our programming. And part of what I do is a lot of waiting for that moment. Waiting for that moment where teachers and schools are really tired of seeing the same test scores over and over again. And even those who climb up somehow because of some teaching to the test, we know that in order for the bell curve to work, they have to create a whole new test. So that's the world of schools. I'm going back to Dr. Durán's original question, how about what we do? How can we bring it into schools? A lot of it is waiting for that moment where they're tired. They're tired of seeing a score that they can't figure out. How the heck am I going to use this information for figuring out what do I do tomorrow? And so I find those moments. So a lot of us are waiting for those moments and then we act on them. And that's one thing I've been able to do with some of the work that I have been doing. But I guess an underlying goal in all that I do is I try to demystify. And in demystifying, we unshackle a little bit of what people think about in terms of school. And in my world, reading. Reading is, I've never seen, the wars are alive and well. I mean, it's a whole new, I've been talking with folks, we have never seen such intensity in compared to recent times. I mean, just in the myopic definition of what it means to read. And so, showing on the ground what that can look like and demystify for educators has been my one way of going, but I've had to be worthy of the attention. So the programming that we do in the schools, what the school leaders noticed is, wow, on these normative standardized tests, they're excelling compared to other schools. Knowing that those tests don't really offer that meaningful information, that's one way that I've been able to cut through and get some of that work into the schools. I don't know if I answered, but the lasting, in order for us to be sustainable, again, I'm going to go back to what I said. We need our higher institutions to be bold. We need them to value what we're doing on the ground with our communities. And I see little evidence of that in my own personnel reviews and in the personnel reviews of my colleagues. What gets funded still isn't normally what we do. And so that's something that we need if we want to be a sustainable society in the work that we do in higher ed.
Thank you, Diana. We're nearing the close of our session, and so I'd like to just kind of thank everyone for their contributions and how do we put things together. I think referring back to, I'm going to conclude with a comment reaction from Micheal that's very important to help us appreciate where we've gone. The issue of evaluation. For some of us, the outcome is not the score. It's not the representation of the outcome. It's the outcome. The outcome is a development of agency and action that is shown in the ways we construe our prolepsis and the way we move ahead in our visions and put our visions into action and into consciousness that is shared among us as a resource for continuing our adaptation in ways that harmonize with a world that is extremely complex and bringing to us conditions and disruptions that need to be dealt with. I'm so pleased that our attention has been on hope and thriving, and on taking up these issues in a way that deals with us as harmonizing to our agencies of our past, brought forth into the present and into the futures that we're responsible for, and appreciate very much Mike's comments also on the intergenerational journey that we're on in terms of revitalizing our knowledge and adaptability to be able to deal with the human condition and with the attention to the Volcker psychology that we are, the ontologies and ways of belief that we know guide our everyday actions that don't make sense as abstractions, but that make sense to us as ways of living together and sharing values as human beings. So thank you all very kindly, and we'll move into our next session. We'll follow up with everyone on where we can take this conversation. Thank you.